The second thing I wanted to talk about is the new regions they're adding. Basically, they're adding a lot of color combinations. So let's go ahead and map this out. I want to talk about basically whether I think it's a good idea or a bad idea, more or less. So let's just draw the combinations. Let's just visualize this. So we've got Ionia, we've got Shadow Isles, we've got Freljord, we've got, I guess there's no purple one, Nox, we've got PNZ, and we have Demacia, which I guess I'll just make yellow. Okay, and once the 6 colors lived in harmony. And if you add 2 more, obviously, and then you can visualize this in like a star pattern with like, we got like a kind of crisscrossed star of combinations. Honestly, I kind of think this visual kind of adds nothing to this explanation. It just kind of like makes it distracting and confusing. And I think it's like ultimately pointless. But there's like a big star of combinations. And you have 15 color combinations. Adding 2 more, let's call them purple and... Wow, they're really running out of colors. Purple and... Wait, what are they going to even do? Brown? Gray? Black? I guess black is a color in games. Purple and black, let's say. So if they do something like that, then you immediately go to 29 combinations. They said that expansion equals new region and cards in other regions to complement that region, so maybe existing region combos won't get many extra archetypes, and Twitch chat isn't the best place to describe the nuance required for this topic. To be honest, I don't think this is... There's a lot of ways to look at it, but I want to make a point here that's I don't think is particularly nuanced or simple. There are 21 combinations, though? Yes, of course, when you're looking at, like, mono. So, mono is not a thing that currently exists in the game, but... If we want to go with mono, 28. Oh, did I do that wrong? Yeah, sure, 28. Yeah. Let's use the erase tool. There we go. Oh, yeah, it's gone. Perfect. So 28, sure. And if we're including mono, then it's in reality 21, and likewise, what is this, 8 colors? So this would be 36, right? So 21 going to 36, or 15 going to 28. From 6 to 8. Let's just talk about 2 regions, because they've mentioned like multiple, and 2 is like they could add 1, they could add 3, but they're probably adding like 2 regions or something. Then they kind of eventually have to run out, right? So the interesting thing with this is it basically gives a lot more diversity, and it means that the game is effectively less interconnected. And this is the important thing to note, is that this is a philosophy that embodies Riot's design philosophy, actually. It might end up making sense. It's a weird thing in my mind to add them afterwards. I do like the idea of having a lot of regions. I'm fine with that. The only problem is that adding them, if depending on how it's planned out, if they have them literally planned out already, and they've had a bunch of concepts and they wanted to make like 8 regions, and these have been planned out for years, because they would have to have been planned out for years. Runeterra has been in development for like 7 years. Like these would have to be planned out for years in advance. And if that were the case, then I definitely wouldn't have a problem with running like 8 regions. So the thing to understand is that on a system like this, so imagine an 8 star, an 8-point star, basically, that would be with like this model with 8 regions. So let's take a game with a higher degree of complexity, and instead of splitting it into 8 colors, instead let's split it into 5. Okay, so we're gonna make like a 5-point system, and I'm not gonna color these in, I'm just making a point in terms of combinatorics. This is basically what Magic the Gathering has. It's got a 5-point system, right? Where you have, you've got like these interwoven combinations, but because you have the same amount of cards and the same amount of complexity, that ends up being interwoven between these 5 points, even though you only have you know, the star looks really bad just because of like the drawing. But that is a star. Even though the points look really bad, you have a lot more complexity because they're kind of like, you have all the same cards that are all like overlapping and all interweaving. Because if you're running a duo color deck, instead of, it's just changing the numbers game, right? Let me explain this in a better way. Instead of like in Magic, it's like choose one out of 5, right? So it's like, you know, choose 5, and then let's say choose 4. I'm going to use this model. I'm not going to talk about mono. I'm not going to talk about tricolor or rainbow or like weird stuff. I'm just going to imagine like every deck is duo, okay? So it's choose 5, and then it's choose 4. Whereas this would be choose 8, and then choose 7, right? The most important thing to understand about this is that there's a big additional step, right? Which is in Magic, once you've chosen the 2 colors, you then have the combinations of the colors, of all the cards in both colors. And those end up multiplying together, right? So let's say you've got 100 cards of one color and 100 of another. And when you have both sets that have like both card pools that have a large amount, you end up with a really, really big number, right? Now let's go ahead and like ratio this down, right? And then because the complexity of potential deck building is going to follow this, right? And then you've got, in this model where you've got choose 8 and choose 7, we're splitting our pool. Instead of we've got a 500 card pool apparently, because I'm doing 100 cards each out of these 5 colors. So we've got a 500 card pool, let's just say. We go ahead and split that into 8, which is, what is that? 62.5. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. 62.5. So, and then times 62, let's say, times 62 or something like that. I think the most important thing at this point in time to understand is that this system ends up with a lot more complexity because you're not dividing your colors around as much, right? So, and that's both a good thing and a bad thing. But I want to actually explain like how the philosophy of this game works, and why there's no neutral cards. Because a lot of people are asking about like color combinations and no neutral cards. So effectively, the most important thing to understand is that diversity in card games is going to follow a function of the combinatorics in your game, like the amount of the way the different combinations are interacting with each other. So what I mean by that is, and let's start simply with a bell curve, and I'll explain this later. But effectively, what this means is that if you have a game with really, really weak combination potential, and by combination potential, I'm saying interconnectivity, basically. The idea of being able to connect any constituent part of one deck from another deck, right? Interconnectivity. If you have a deck with really low interconnectivity, basically you end up in a game that there's kind of no choice making. So imagine a game where it's just kind of like you're playing, but the setup to the game, it's like there's no deck building. You're just using a pre-bought deck or something, right? That is the idea of just like low combinations here. Because you have like a meta with low diversity. This bell curve represents diversity. If you have a game with very, very, very high combinations, then you have something over here. And the reason for this is because if your combinations are high enough, there eventually will be some broken concept, right? That's the problem. Because if your deck is too interconnected, or not your deck, sorry. If your game strategies, and this doesn't apply just to card games, it's kind of easier to talk about with card games, honestly. But if your deck applies to basically, or sorry, if your strategies all just interweave with each other so much, and there's so much scalability, then your ladder will just get dominated by one deck that just ends up breaking the game, right? So in reality, you really want something in the middle, right? You want a certain amount of combinationality. That's probably not the best word to use. But you want a certain amount of interconnectivity in your game by design. And the most important thing to understand about this is we can kind of break down card games into, and this is something that I've done somewhat in my consulting, which is just like looking at a lot of concepts. Like neutral cards are a really good example of this. So the thing about neutral cards, so I can say Gwent, if we use Gwent as an example, it's gone through different processes. At some points in old Gwent, it's been here, where like the crazy combo potential was so much it ended up kind of stifling a lot of situations. Not all patches, but there were some patches in old Gwent that kind of felt like they were on the side of things. And then in new Gwent, it's kind of more like this, right? Which is concepts like crazy and scalable effects. Not crazy effects, but scalable effects. What I mean when I say scalable effect is not a card that's super strong per se, but a card that will fit with, you can look at it and you can think of, oh, there's so many ways for this to fit, right? There's so many different situations for this to fit into. Okay. This is also, by the way, the problem with design space. Design space as an argument, honestly, it's kind of a meaningless phrase. But basically, the idea of design space is like just moving this direction here, and a lot of games try to get design space by kind of moving from like this part of the curve to this part, which is a terrible idea. And I would say that's part of like what Gwent has been doing, and that's negative. Design space is important when you're like, your game is too interconnected that certain things are being broken, and it applies to that. But the important thing to understand is design space isn't like a general. It shouldn't have a good connotation. You don't want, if your game has too much design space, it will lead to a game where your players can't do a lot of combinations, right? And it's all about combinations, right? If this high interconnection, wouldn't there be other broken decks? Yes, but you get like exponential power scaling, so they're not always going to be like on the same level as each other. Yes, like every deck that's going to be played is going to be broken to different degrees, but just because there's there's not going to be any like reference point for like how strong a broken deck is. Some are just going to be more broken than others, right? Because at that point you're dealing with exponentiation. It's not like the state is no longer linear. It's not like, oh, my deck is 2 points higher than yours. Oh, your deck is 2 points higher than mine. Because with these combinations, it's just like my deck is 10 times better than yours, right? Exaggerating, but that's beside the point. Okay, so when you look at this, the point to understand is that I look at game design as sort of having almost a resource. I think it's kind of easy to look at that in that way, of having a resource that I have. I've been calling CP, or combination points, almost. And the interesting thing about this framework is basically there's different things in your game that can sort of like spend CP, and sort of things that can give CP, if that makes sense. As a random example, rotations, having like seasonal or yearly rotations is a good way to gain CP, combination points, that you can effectively spend on interesting concepts. Because what rotations allow for is that, you'll be able to have really, rotations. By having rotations in your game, you get CP. Imagine you have a resource that's CP, combination points. So by having rotations in your game, you can then afford to spend that CP on something that will increase connectivity in other ways, okay? So basically, look at this like this. If you have a game that has rotations, it means you can print more interesting effects, right? That's true. If you have no rotations, your effects can't be as scalable and therefore as interesting, okay? That makes sense. So that's why rotations are good. And the fundamental thing to understand about this, the most important thing, is that there's different ways of spending CP, and there's different ways of gaining CP. As a developer, when you're building a game that's based on like these meta ecosystems and what players are allowed to do, as a developer, your choice is to decide what things you want to do to gain CP and what things you want to do to spend CP, okay? Gaining CP can be done by having stuff like rotations. Stuff like having no neutrals, like Runeterra does, is a way to gain CP. When I say new neutrals, I should clarify, like, no interesting neutrals. This was a large problem that with Gwent had. Gwent spent a lot of CP on its neutral cards. You could look at it that way. Because neutral cards are so inherently scalable, when you have neutral cards that have like crazy effects, that you can find places for all sorts of things. Royal Decree is a decent example of that, because Royal Decree, like, just old Royal Decree, when it like didn't cost provisions, and it was enabling a lot of like crazy combos, which I'm not gonna make the claim necessarily that it was all bad. I could see it having like some kind of tweak, but that's just an example of my point here, where it's like, it's an interesting card that allows a lot of interesting combos, but if you make stuff too interesting, then your diversity goes down because your game gets kind of broken, right? When you have locked classes, that's another way of gaining CP. That's what Hearthstone does. Having boring cards is another way of gaining CP. That's what Gwent decided to do. Having bigger deck size and like more and like less copies of stuff is another way of gaining CP. And maybe like a land system, right? The point is that there's different ways of doing that, and your job in a card game especially is to kind of like figure out the most efficient ways to gain CP and the most efficient ways to spend it. For example, I think rotations are a phenomenal way to gain CP. I think they just make sense personally. They might have, I could see certain tweaks, but I think rotations are just a great way of making sure the number of combinatorial cards, you know, the like, because it's like exponential, right? Like when you have a game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Without rotations, they have like ban lists, and they have to have ban lists, but they don't have rotations. So the exponential amount of combo ability is so entirely crazy in Yu-Gi-Oh! That's typically why a lot of people kind of feel like it's a joke of a game. Now, there's a lot of people that like Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'm not trying to shame you if you do, but not a lot. I mean, most card game players agree that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like it's crazy and not necessarily in a good way. So the goal is basically finding efficient ways of getting CP and finding efficient ways of spending CP. Ways of spending CP, by the way, are kind of the opposite stuff. So stuff like neutral cards, you can spend CP on neutral cards, interesting neutral cards that are scalable and can fit with any deck. Stuff like color mixing to varying degrees. That's what Magic does. Magic has very intense color mixing. More like kind of interesting and comboable cards, and you know, more like kind of like more copies of cards per deck. And even potentially stuff like Mulligan system will change this, because it just comes down to reliably being able to link certain things. And if there's like, I don't know, like for example, a card like Exodia, that's an extreme example. Like cards that are only good when you draw them with each other. That kind of deck is going to be basically able to work or not based on how much, you know, combo ability you have. Yu-Gi-Oh! Didn't ever have rotations. So the Exodia concept, which wasn't, you know, I didn't have a lot of support at the start. Every time they kept printing more cards, there were eventually decks that were basically able to get like 100% win rate with Exodia. I'm not even really exaggerating. And that's obviously not good, because basically you just win on turn one with Exodia. Your hand just draws your entire deck, right? And at that point, you have to ban Exodia. That's just kind of how it works. Exodia sucks now, though. I haven't been following it in ages. Maybe they changed some stuff that makes Exodia suck now. But either way, that's not really the point I'm making here. The point is that this is why Runeterra has no neutrals. Okay? So, Riot and Valve are the studios that have two very, 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 very different philosophies of game design. And I'm going to use this model to explain that. Let's go ahead and make a new page. So Valve, I'm going to draw the artifact logo here. What was the artifact logo? Was it this? It was something like this. So Valve basically makes games that have high interconnectivity. And these are games like Magic. You can think of these two types of, like, these two ends of the spectrum as the difference between draft and constructed, okay? Valve tends to make games that are pretty drafty, right? And you'll notice this in all their games. Artifact is a game that had kind of like, the cards that were printed on Artifact weren't particularly interesting, but it was extremely freeform, right? You can combine whatever you want without as much limitations, right? That's the most important thing. So Artifact is freeform. Dota is the same way. You'll look at it, you'll realize it's the same comparison to League. Dota is a game that's a lot more sandboxy. You can do a lot of crazy stuff. You as a player have more agency. You can run whatever you want as a support, whatever you want as a carry. I'm not saying this as a good thing necessarily. I'm actually going to talk about why this is usually a bad thing. But I'm just saying Dota is a game where you are more free form than League, right? Where League of Legends is more railed. Railed is just a term. It's like, you as a player have kind of limited options. You can think of it almost a bit more like a roller coaster, where it's on rails and you're just kind of down for the ride. Whereas, in Valve, you're bumper cars. Bumper cars are basically your idea of, it's free form. They're both different types of fun, right? But bumper cars are your players generate their own fun. And roller coasters not, it's maybe more like an Easter egg hunt where the devs will kind of put things for you and you're kind of, you're more so playing a controlled environment that they just have more control over. So you can see this also in, what was that other multiplayer game Valve made? Wasn't there one more apart from TF2? I mean, you can use the TF2 and Overwatch comparison if you want. It's a weird comparison too, and I know they didn't do Overwatch obviously, but it's the point is the Valve's game design is very, very freeform. They want games to feel not necessarily like a sandbox per se, but they do things that are much more just freedom as a player, which isn't, by the way, and the cost. There's a big cost to this. The big cost to this is they have to often make concepts less unique or interesting because otherwise you have a balance. Keep in mind, like, every game needs to have pretty much like the goal of a game, and maybe the phrasing of what I'm about to say could be improved, but games want to be about as equally complex. Complex isn't the right word. I'm not sure if there's a word for what I'm like meaning right now, but the idea of complexity is something that, like, you can't really defy a certain amount of like complexity that's good, right? You can choose in what way you want that complexity to be presenting. Then that's what you have control over. So a game like Dota, or I'm going to use Artifact as an example, which is because you've got more combo ability. You can't do as interesting things. The comparison from League to Dota would be less direct. I don't know enough about League, and honestly, I haven't even played Dota in like 4 years. So I'm just gonna basically talk about Artifacts and Runeterra. So Artifact, because you can combo more things and you have much more freedom, it means that your game is going to be limited in other ways. In this case, like card design. Right, you'll notice Artifact effectively was able to gain some CP by having no neutrals, in the same way that Runeterra has no neutrals. They both have no neutrals, and that's good. But when your method of gaining CP is boring cards, like it is with Gwent and Artifact, I think that's a bad game. I would say out of all the ways to gain CP, that is the worst one, period, right? So if you're designing a game that's based on these combinations, and for the most part, this is looking at... Card games are easily the best example of all this because they're very like logical and probability based, but I mean the same principles apply for all games. The point is that when you have like more potential combinations, your individual average combination loses complexity, right? Because complexity is effectively a resource. Your game can only have a certain amount of complexity before it breaks. There's a popping point, right? That's my point. So you look at Runeterra, and in Runeterra, they offer a much more railed experience. You cannot color combine in... You can't color combine more than just like the way you want. You can't even really build mono decks in Runeterra. Like Allegiance kind of baits you into thinking mono as a concept in Runeterra. And eventually they probably will want it to be a concept. So I'm not even gonna really talk about mono in this. But it's just like every deck is 2 colors, right? There's not as much sort of creativity there. But it's not really about the color system so much as it is about, the lack of neutrals is bigger. The lack of neutrals is a lot bigger than limiting every deck to 2 colors. The thing that neutrals add is every deck has 3 colors, right? If there's a neutral in your game, if there's a neutral category, every deck just has 3 colors, and the third color is neutral, right? So every deck becomes a lot more complex, and you have to spend a lot of time just making sure your neutral cards are balanced. And neutral is a really unbalanceable concept, right? And the third thing that reduces the combination potential in this game is the card design. You'll notice with the archetypes and the card design, it's very set up for you as a player, you know? And I think that's a problem that a lot of like card game players, a lot of card game, like, not, I wouldn't say a majority, but definitely I've heard a lot of card game players don't like Runeterra because they don't feel like they have as much agency over the deck building process. You know, like if you want to play a stun recall deck, you can tell that, you know, I'm just looking and it's like, you know, I should run Yasuo and some of the Noxus cards. And Katarina's kind of, I think, almost designed for this deck, but honestly, she ends up not being necessarily great for it. And there's pretty few examples where you can kind of like deviate too much from that. Like every 2-color combination has kind of like a set there thing for you to find as a player and for you to play. And there is tweaking and there is min-maxing, but the downside of this one is that even though you have individual complexities higher, there's a lot of very interesting cards in Runeterra, but the combinations between cards is more limited because the interesting cards are kind of all on a specific track, right? Like the interesting cards are just like, oh, this deck kind of builds itself, so to speak. I mean, again, I think that's a reductionist argument. Like in reality, no deck builds itself. Like there's still a lot of micro decisions to make, but there's not really as much new archetypes to discover, reasonably speaking. I mean, there might be one or two. Formulaic, that's a decent word for it, right? So both styles have downsides. But this is something to consider when we're looking at like the new regions. So then you look at the region argument. Like I said, I think I don't like the fact that they're adding these regions in later, because I know the game has been in development for a super, super, super long time. And I don't know what archetypal mechanical concepts you could base these new regions around that wouldn't feel either like an afterthought or being forced. An afterthought being something that is not a mechanic that is actually good for the game necessarily, but just something you want for the sake of having a new region. And being forced being something that's like, this is actually a mechanic that could totally just fit into one of the regions we have already, but we want to make a new region, so we're just going to do another one, right? Those are the problems I have with new regions. I have literally zero problems with the idea of having the way the combination is distributed, where it's like 8 different colors combining in different ways. That's not my problem. My problem is more so the potential timing mentality of like adding something fundamental to the game after the game has been out for a while. I haven't liked that in card games in the past. Like when they added factions for Gwent, I always thought that was very weird. Obviously, Nilfgaard doesn't count because that was added, like, that was pre-planned, right? That's the difference, right? If it's pre-planned or if it's not. So when it comes to the regions, I mean, just look at everything I'm talking about right now, and you'll understand exactly how this fits their philosophy perfectly, which is that you're limiting your player combinations, or I shouldn't say it like that. You're limiting the crazy scalable combinations that you would have by having, you know, like your cards divided into like 4 or 5 regions. Like imagine a game with no regions. Imagine a game where no factions, no regions, no classes. It would have a hard time working because it would be really hard to print crazy things without them literally breaking the game. In fact, it would be basically impossible. Okay? So having more regions steers away from that in a potentially good way. I mean, I definitely don't dislike it. I'm fine with this approach in general. It has its pros and cons. But the idea is, you mean like Yu-Gi-Oh? Yeah, it's sort of like Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's why Yu-Gi-Oh! Kind of had to curve into archetypes. But like early Yu-Gi-Oh! Yes. Before Yu-Gi-Oh! Even had archetypes, yes. That was the problem with early Yu-Gi-Oh! And it was a really, really flawed game. And then they added archetypes and that helped. But I mean, Yu-Gi-Oh's I'm not going to talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! in this talk. Not more than I already have. Okay? So you look at like the 8 region by 2, you know, and I think I like 8 by 2 or 9 by 2 or whatever it ends up being. I think I like that better than Magic's, like it's kind of more like a 5 by it's hard to quantify because Magic has like neutral cards that you can consider adding in like artifacts, and they've got like 3 color decks, and they've got, you know, 1 color decks, which Runeterra will eventually have 1 color decks, I guess, but there's just fundamental to the rules of the game, there is no real reason to be in 1 color in Runeterra. And there is in Magic, in the fundamentals, in like land systems, basically, right? So like, even though Runeterra will have mono decks, they'll have to be really, really forced for them to feel like on the level of playability that Magic's mono deck are, which, I mean, that's a real thing. And I don't mind that either, by the way, necessarily. But the point is, they're kind of allowing for effectively more sort of diverse and interesting experiences, with the one caveat that it's harder for a lot of them to feel as player created, you know? And you'll see this exact philosophy represented in their draft system as well. Their draft system does the same exact thing, where they have expeditions. They have the idea of, you know, I'm going to create like divergent, you know, these kind of archetypes instead of allowing like free farm. I think in reality, I think there's a lot of developers that try to do a sort of freeform or sandboxy concept that is an unrailed experience, and I think it almost always failed. Do you remember like that? There was that 5-year period in gaming where like procedural generation was huge. Like, you know, Minecraft blew up, and obviously there were a lot of like Minecraft clones, and then even like past that, procedural generation just kept getting like, you know, like like No Man's Sky is kind of like the best example. And I know they patched it, and I know it's better, but procedural generation is kind of the point where it's like you can create a game that has really complex, like crazy exponential different experiences, but if those experiences aren't tailored as dependently by the developers themselves, they're probably not necessarily going to be good ones, right? And yes, there's some exceptions. I mean, Minecraft is a popular game. It's possible to do this right. But my point is, there's that, if you remember this period in gaming where this was big and almost all of the games that came out with it just sucked, then like you'll see the issue with this, right? My point is that a lot of developers tried to do this approach of just like freeform, let the players have more agency. I'm going to build this thing as a developer, which I'm not really going to try to design an experience necessarily. I'm going to try to either allow players to design their own experience, or like create something that will just randomly design experiences somewhat. That this mentality I feel like is very, very commonly failed, right? Which isn't to say, again, it can't be pulled off, but usually this fails, and sometimes randomly it succeeds, right? This is kind of like generally a safe approach. That's kind of like all I wanted to say about that. So in terms of like regions and how they kind of work with combo, first of all, I think having no neutrals is pretty genius. Obviously, Runeterra is not the first game to do it. Even Artifact had no neutrals, but I think no neutrals is pretty good. I think I really hate neutrals in card games. If you actually look at Hearthstone, no, seriously, like look at Hearthstone as a game. Hearthstone is kind of like plagued by neutrals really, really badly. And they kind of have to be, because neutrals exist in Hearthstone because of their own selling point, their price point, which is you know, it's expensive, so you kind of need neutrals. You can't escape from them with Hearthstone, really. And you look at the Hearthstone card pool, if you actually count, like 45% of the cards printed are neutrals. Maybe closer to 40. But it's like you've got 9 classes, 40% of your card pool is neutrals, so you've got the other 60% divided by that 9, so that's like 7% per region or class in Hearthstone. So that means that your class is going to have 1/6 of the card pool that the neutrals totally have, and Hearthstone is in a position where it's forced into that. So you lose a lot of diversity, and you lose a lot of like combo potential in terms of being able to print cards that have kind of as interesting scalability design. What I mean by that is because like basically the neutrals in Hearthstone, for the most part, have to be pretty simple or have to be pretty constrained, because they can combo with anything. You just kind of paint yourself into a corner if you have neutrals that are interesting. And if you're designing a subset of cards that is inherently limited to not really being super comboable, then you're already kind of like behind, right? So Hearthstone is a good example of this. Let's actually, so honestly, literally imagine. So look at Hearthstone's system. I really don't like it. Hearthstone does some things well. Honestly, it does. I don't hate the game. I'm not like an anti-Hearthstone person necessarily. But if you look at Hearthstone systems with like the 9 classes, so how it works is you've got 9 classes, and you've got, is this 9? Let's pretend this is 9, even if it's not. I don't care. But you've got 9 classes, and then you've got neutral in the center. And this is your combinations. Every class just goes with neutral. It's railed in a way that honestly is just inherently uninteresting. Like literally, so Runeterra will probably have 9 regions. It's gonna be 8 like a year and a half from now, and they're probably gonna add a 9th one. When Runeterra has 9 regions, it'll be the same exact thing, except like imagine Hearthstone, except every color has the same second region, which is neutral. Like, just imagine that game. Imagine if Runeterra had 9 regions, but the deck building process was every single color has the same second region. How stupid would that be? It would be pretty dumb. Again, Hearthstone does a lot of things well, honestly. And especially, like, for the time of this phase, sure. But the way that it handles, like, the combinations, the design of kind of splitting these pies is pretty poor. The idea of just 9 classes plus region. Isn't that already Runeterra with SI? That's kind of funny. I mean, a little bit. I don't even know if SI is like... I mean, SI is really good, but so are Demacia and Ionia, so, no. Who knows? So, that's it. That's basically my point with all this. The idea of having, like, 8 different regions is pretty crazy. I mean, they're basically doing the same thing that Hearthstone's doing. But because they're able to, like, cut out neutrals, which they can do because the game is, like, more legitimately free to play. I don't know. I mean, we don't know exactly how card acquisition works, but they've basically modeled... They've shown, unless they were out blatantly lying, they've shown that the card acquisition is going to be very literally hundreds of times faster than Hearthstone. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. You don't really get cards by playing Hearthstone. You get, like, the daily... Depends on how many dailies you're doing, but, like, after daily quests, you actually get basically nothing from playing Hearthstone. You effectively have to either buy them or maybe just, like, get resources through draft. Hearthstone, like... So when I say Runeterra's acquisition is hundreds of times, I did approximate it. It's something like that. Yeah, it's hundreds of times faster than Hearthstone. You get 10 gold per 3 wins. Right, you get 10 gold per 3 wins in Hearthstone. You get 10 gold per 3 wins. That's so crazy. So every 6 games, if you're maintaining a 50-50, which is close to the average, every 6 games you're getting 10 gold. So you're getting 1.4 gold per game. 1.4 gold per game. Which means if you play 60 games on average, if you're a good player, let's say 50, if you're winning more than you're losing. So let's say 50 games, you get 1 pack. 1 pack is 5 cards. 10 games gets you 1 card. That's so crazy. Maybe it's not hundreds of times faster, but it is like 50 times faster, or like it is a really crazy amount faster in Runeterra. If, you know, I mean, I don't think they'll change the numbers that they've said. Who knows? I mean, the game's not even out yet, but... And it's capped at 30 per day? Yeah, sure. That's so weird that they even do that. Is that like an anti-bot thing? Like, why would they even do that? That's... Huh. So, I don't know. When it comes to this philosophy of design, by the way, I think that I probably like the Riot's approach more than Valve's, and I'm not really saying that because Artifact didn't work for a lot of reasons. This is by the way, this is a really, really, really understated reason for Artifact's downfall. This is probably a hot take, but I think this is probably a bigger reason for Artifact's failure than economy even. And I know exactly the gravity of the statement I just made, because obviously the economy of Artifact was awful. But the fact that you don't have divergent gameplay makes it fundamentally imbalanceable. That's the most important thing to understand. Is that these games, because they're freeform, because players can kind of like do as much as they want and there's less divergent gameplay, these kinds of games are really, really, really hard to balance. You need to... If they skew in like this direction, like the difficulty of balance is literally a linear function of this spectrum. Like if your game is more railed, it's easier to balance. If it's more sandboxy or more like comboable, it's harder to balance, period. There's no escaping that. So that's the problem. Anyone who's complaining about balance and Artifacts, I think is kind of missing the point. Because
because Artifact didn't really suffer from balance problems per se. Like, it doesn't really matter that they nerf Axe. Like, that's neat, but they can nerf Axe, and Axe will still be played in, like, every red deck, because he's still the best thing. And if you have a scale that compares things, like, linearly, and, like, one thing is better than other things, then you're not going to be able to enter a situation where the game is fundamentally balanceable, right? Balance doesn't matter. Balance is, like, the most overrated concept in game design. Nobody gives a shit if your game is balanced. Your game needs to be balanceable. Most players think that a game needs balance changes, when in reality, it's the fundamentals of the game that make it impossible to balance. The best example is, like, the Underlords, where because of their design, they couldn't have been balanced. You know, I mean, you can make them as close to the power level as you want, but because there's no reason to pick one over the other, there's no situationality to it. Even if you're a player with diverse ranges, you're always going to pick the one that's better. So the problem isn't the balance. The problem is the linear scale that the cards are on. And of course, when you have a game that's more freeform and less railed, it will be more convergent. Period. Like, there will be some ways to make exceptions to that, for sure, but more convergent games means you're going to have more balance problems. So, I don't know. I mean, it's definitely, you might say, like, somewhere on the spectrum here is good or somewhere here is good, but the most important thing to understand is, like, a lot of games make the mistake of being too far this way. And I'm very happy with how Riot is effectively trying to do this. With cutting neutrals, I'm very happy with. Adding more regions, I'm skeptical about their design implications of adding regions later, but having, like, 8 regions that you can only ever choose 2 of, I'm happy with. Why not? And they'll probably add mana to the game. I think that one concern I have is that Riot might feel like Allegiance is adding mana to the game. And it's not. Now that, you could argue that's not a bad thing. You could totally argue Allegiance is fine the way it is. Even though it'll never incentivize mono decks. You'd have to print more Allegiance cards. I think Allegiance is fairly poorly designed. I'm actually really not a fan of Allegiance as a keyword. I think I disagree with almost everything about its design, actually. Allegiance just needs a rework. I think I agree with that, yeah. And in reality, like, here's something you really have to understand about game design. This is, like, cynical, what I'm about to say. But it's very true. Okay. So, I think that don't get me wrong. Yeah, this is pretty cynical. So the point is, game design has evolved from a narrative to a meta-narrative. I'm going to explain what I mean by that, because that's been a shift that's happened in the past, like, 15 or 20 years. So you look at basic game design, Magic the Gathering, Dungeons and Dragons. I can use pretty much any title from early games. They don't even have to be that early. They can be like early 2000s maybe. The narrative is you're a wizard in a place, you're casting spells, you're cool. You're in your imagination, you're cool. Okay? That's the narrative that the design is selling you. And it's fun to pretend. The change that has happened in the past like 15 or 20 years is that games do sell you that narrative, but they also sell you a meta-narrative because they make you think that you're better at the game than you actually are. Nobody likes being bad. Nobody likes feeling bad. So game design as an art form has evolved from I'm a wizard in a castle, let's play pretend, to I'm a good player who's playing pretend that he's wizard in a castle. Let's play pretend. That's a slight exaggeration. Like, to a degree, that's, it's not as if that's every game ever and that's every decision made in every game ever, but there's a lot of decisions in games that are like that. This ranking system is one of them. People don't like feeling like they're bad. And there's a lot of things in games. Like, for example, let's just talk about Overwatch.
Something that in Overwatch, remember when Overwatch came out and it was like the play of the match was just people pressing ulti, right? The play of the game. The great smart feature by Blizzard, by the way, that play of the game concept. It's, you know, worked very well. And they I mean, they keep the algorithm intentionally weak, and they make sure that it focuses on ultis over, like, you know, skill shots or air shots. They don't want to strengthen the algorithm because they want people to feel like they're good. There was very literally a Reddit post on Overwatch subreddit where some, like, literal 5-year-old kid, the post was literally, my 5-year-old son just got play of the game as Reaper. I'm literally not shitting you when I say this. Like, that was a post on the Overwatch subreddit. And it was a clip, right? And that's people like that. People like that feeling of, like, kind of pretending that they're good. Of having those moments where they can kind of feel like that. And again, it's sort of cynical. This isn't like, it's not every decision ever, but if you look for that, you'll see that pretty much every successful game is doing that. And you might even say that that's part of the reason Artifact failed. That would be a really small part of the reason, but it would be down there, you know? I mean, I'm not even really talking about progression so much, but the ability to, for example, beat players on variance, right? It's the same thing as RNG. That's part of the reason that RNG is in games. It's so crazy to understand this. And it's so incredibly crazy. Do you guys understand a large part of the reason why RNG is in games? I think you don't. This is, like, super backwards. Like, nobody's thinking in these terms. It's really hilarious. This isn't necessarily the biggest part of the reason RNG is in games. Scapegoat to protect players' egos. Yes, that's basically what I'm going to say, but it's funnier than that. Yes. So that's something people understand. That's one of the reasons RNG is actually important in games. Because when your game has too much player control, you will lose, and when you lose a lot, you'll quit. That's what I'm saying when I'm saying that's part of the problem with Artifact. Because when you're a new player playing Artifact, you're going to get dumpstered in your first 10 games, not because of the amount of RNG that there is, but because of the opposite. Because you have so much control over the game that your opponent will just shit on you over and over and over again if they're a better player than you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And 50% of your players will be below average, because that's how averages work, right? Nobody likes being below average. Everyone thinks average means, like, 70th percentile or 80th percentile. But, I mean, obviously it doesn't, right? Nobody likes being below average. So, here's the thing. Here's the thing that's really hilarious and really backwards. Okay? The reason RNG is in the game is because you have these good players that effectively want someone to blame, or something external to blame when they lose. When I say good players, maybe they like to think they're better than they are, because literally everyone does this. This is human psychology. Everyone thinks they're a bit better than they are. Like, that's just how human beings work, because we judge ourselves based on our thoughts, and we judge others based on their actions, and there's an inherent flaw in that concept, in that process. Everyone thinks they're a bit better than they are, right? Okay? And the problem is, you need people to not realize, you need your player base to kind of not realize how good they actually are, because they're not going to like that realization. And that's part of the reason RNG is in your game. So the really funny thing, the really backwards thing, is that RNG is in the game partly for the players that complain about it. Literally for those players. Like, think about that. And that's very true. Now, I can't say that's the biggest reason RNG is in games, but that is one of the more major ones. Literally the same people that are like, oh god, I'm so good, and RNG is why I lose. That is why RNG is in the game. Because of those people. Because it lets them complain. And because when they have nothing to complain about, when they just get shit on, and don't have excuses, they quit your game. That's, again, Artifact had so many issues, but that is one of the things that happened with Artifact. A lot of people, like, played for a couple hours, just got shit on and quit. Okay? Especially after, like, the initial player base died down. Like people coming in after just were against, like, people that were good, right? And that was just horrible. And that's so incredibly hilarious to me. That's so funny to me. That the players the exact players that are complaining about RNG are the ones that it's designed for.
And you could say it's designed for newer players as well, and it is. Yeah, I mean RNG is good for also like newer players that want want to be able to take some wins off, right? But the thing is, if you have some players that have 80% win rates, that means some players are going to have 20% win rates. You have to share the win rates, so you need some kind of variance. There's ways of doing variants that are better and worse than others, and that's a different conversation. There's good types of RNG and bad types of RNG. Sure, it's not the primary goal of RNG. No, it's not. It's not. It's like goal number 3 or 4 or 5, but it is one of the goals. Yes, it is on all in the RNG does a lot of things, but yeah, I mean there's good types of RNGs and bad types of RNGs, right? I thought Artifact had RNG somewhat. The most important thing to understand is with RNG, it's not a metric of how many coin flips are done. It's a metric of the ratio of the agency you have as a player towards the impact of the game compared to how much RNG there is based on like the size of the coin flip. So RNG Artifact had a lot of coin flips, but it was mostly a lot of small coin flips, except for when you compare that to Hearthstone, which a couple of metas have had like a couple big coin flips. Like Ragnaros is a good example of a big coin flip. Instead of a lot of little coin flips, is like one big coin flip that can decide the game. That's going to be higher variance. In addition to that, because Artifact was a situation where even though there's higher RNG, there's a lot more player agency in terms of what could have been done or what could have been done wrong. There's so many situations in a game like Hearthstone or Magic that there will be an inevitable loss. Not really that common, honestly, because most games are played like pretty far from perfect play level. But in Artifact, it's hard to look at a game of Artifact and just felt there's nothing I could have done, right? Because you have so much agency as a player. Your decision making is so much higher. So again, RNG, people don't. It's not about RNG coin flips. It's not about the amount of coin flips. It's about the ratio of agency to RNG, because they're complementary factors, right? Man. I'm kind of disappointed about that announcement, huh? What else are we gonna talk about? I mean, I'm just kind of sitting here in the Runeterra directory talking about game design. I guess we could talk about other things. Is there anything else? Were there Reddit detectives that like found out anything? Is the Garfield talk I referenced? Is that the one on the cruise? That one's all right. He makes a few good points on that one, yeah, for sure. But yeah, RNG is like a very necessary component in most games, especially card games. If you hate RNG, you're misattributing it. You hate certain types of RNG, basically. I mean, you could consider a lot of people will lump like Yomi, which is Yomi is what people call the kind of like bluffable concept, like simultaneous play, or rock paper scissors is like Yomi, which is, I mean, you can call that a kind of RNG because it effectively is. Like in reality, you can say it involves skill, but in reality, you also realize that the GTO variation of rock paper scissors is to literally just like roll a dice to determine what you're gonna play. So I mean, it is RNG. I would call Yomi a form of RNG. Go be a YouTuber, React Andy if you're out of content. Maybe that's the answer. Yeah, that could work. What do you think about having bots in the game that intentionally lose? I unironically think that when bots are able to, when the technology is better and they're less detectable, I unironically think that that's part of how games are successful. I also want to point out, and this is like, again, this is not really so much cynical. So I actually like Fortnite. Well, I don't dislike it. It's not a game for me, but it's designed a lot of things in smart ways. Even if some of the things is done are dumb, it gets a bad rap. The funny thing to imagine is that Fortnite is kind of already doing that. Because I've played some Fortnite. I don't think they're literally botting, because I think people would know if they were. But the thing is, by having like the widespread presence that they do, and by marketing to children, if I load into a Fortnite game right now, I'll immediately kill like 4 people. Because I think some of them are literally like either like 7 years old, or they're letting their dog play, or they're like on mobile. I don't know if it's, you can play Fortnite on mobile, right? That's the thing. Like, it's accomplishing the same thing. Like, unironically, that is part of the reason why Fortnite is enjoyed. Not a big part, because Fortnite blew up before all that, but that is part of the enjoyment you get from Fortnite, because you're able to go in, and if you're even a decent player, you can just, kill a few people, and a lot of people are just kind of like
you know, just running around and not even really seriously playing, you know, like, because if everyone in Fortnite was a good player, you know, it would feel a lot worse. That's also, you know, if we're getting into Fortnite, the Bloom argument, the RNG, that's why Bloom is in the game. It's for the same exact reason. It's like you're in a DM with someone. This person's a little bit better than you, but of course you're not going to think that. You think you're better than everyone because everyone thinks they're like 10% better than they are. Not necessarily a lot, but everyone thinks they're better than they are. There's like almost no exception to that. So you're in a DM with someone who's like 2% better than you really are, and you miss a shot from Bloom, and you're like, fucking Bloom. Then you go on Reddit and make a Reddit post, and then you load up another game of Fortnite. Instead of just like raging at yourself and quitting the game. Because nobody likes blaming themselves. It's a very literally unpleasant experience. And if your game is forcing people to blame themselves, then your game is instilling an unpleasant experience in your user. And that's not only is it going to lose you players, but you might argue that you're causing people a disservice. It's in debatable terms. You could argue that it's like, I mean, you could argue that it sort of brings out the worst in people to create systems that are going to feed off of their insecurities. Then that's why I said it's very cynical to take that approach. It is something that's being done, right? Like big games are like that is part of the cell. You know, this isn't just like a weird theory. But I mean, on the other hand, you can't really fight human nature either, right? Like I don't know if there's really a solution to that other than just kind of accepting it, right? That was a good talk. I enjoy that. I like being able to talk about like game design with you guys.